In putting this show together, the idea here, of course, was to honor those who had passed on, who had left behind an interesting story. Somebody you may know, somebody you may not know. Things that have always been part of the collective consciousness of what makes our society what it is, the history of this country laid bare for all of us to sort of figure out on our own, if you will. And it became sort of an interesting point of contention here when we decided that we would take on this particular subject, because drinking with dead people is not so much about enjoying those individuals as much as it is the history that those folks had left behind. That's why this time out it's going to be a little bit different and maybe a bit difficult. The reason being, today we talk about those who had died for the Confederate States of America in the Civil War.
Every stone marks a story. Interesting stories, people like you and I. History that should be recounted. Here we toast those you may or may not know who have gone on before us and left behind their tales to be told. Here we'll be drinking with dead people.
It's just after Mother's Day here in Memphis. Mother's Day is an interesting holiday because it was put together originally as a way to honor the mothers and widows of soldiers who had been killed in the Civil War. And when you're in Memphis and in the South, the Civil War is an interesting issue because how do you deal with such a thing? It was an ugly war. It was a bloody war. It was a horrible affair. And how do you go to honor that kind of dead? One side fighting for one thing, another side fighting for the other. This video is not about that. I'm not going to get into the details, the minutiae, the politics behind fighting such a war. These sorts of things are best left to the real historians to let them chew on and figure out and sort out for the rest of eternity, because that's just the way it seems to be. Over 150 years later, we seem to still be fighting this war. Not too terribly long ago here in Memphis, there were a lot of monuments dedicated to the Civil War and certain individuals that were torn down by the city because it just created too much animosity and it was a problem. Well, there were those who thought that history was being rewritten as a result of that, and that's certainly not the case at all, as this is a testament to that. This particular area is Confederate Rest. It was originally conceived in 1866. It really wasn't put together finally until 1878, when a lot of the dead from in and around here who fought in various battles in and around Memphis in the Mid-South and as far south as mid-Mississippi would be interred here at Elmwood Park. This would be a place to honor those folks, as this cemetery was really only very, very young at the time, and Elmwood at the time, the owners of it, donated this land to take care of that. There's over 1,000 soldiers buried here, and such as it is, it is a monument to those who had died fighting for what they believed in. What they believed in, well, you know, how do you honor that sort of thing? And that's part of what this show has been sort of about, is what do? We'd like to drink with the dead because it's part of the fun and the charm of remembering those that had an interesting tale and left those behind to tell it. But with something like this, it's a little bit different. You've often heard the term participation trophies. That's often what has been left behind in various cities that were erected during the time of the Jim Crow laws. And it was done as sort of a way to keep people of color tuned into the fact that there was a war that was fought over this whole thing. And it wasn't going to be for another 100 years. In the 1960s, when the civil rights movement became a thing, and eventually all of this would be washed away and racism would be made gone. It wasn't the case, as you very well know. Those wars are still being fought. As a matter of fact, I wouldn't be surprised if there's arguments in the comments section below this very video. Be that as it may, this was an interesting spot and an interesting situation to put together. There are several unknown soldiers that are buried here. Quite a few of them, actually. These smaller little headstones that you see that have numbers on them denote certain individuals that have yet to be identified. And these longer military-style rectangular headstones are those that we do know who is buried here. It was a tough time, a very bloody war. It wasn't really known for carrying great deep records at the time as well. So once everything began to sort itself out by the end of the war, you still had very strong divisions the way people thought, even though the South, in fact, did lose the war. In fact, into sort of a running gag, as they call it in some places, the Great Northern Aggression. Be that as it may, how does one honor these sorts of things when they are following a belief or a system that, well, quite frankly, isn't up to speed? You see, one of the arguments that's out there about the Civil War has always been about the reasons why the South did what it did, why they seceded from the Union, why the United States became, in essence, two separate countries. Well, the fact of the matter is, and it's a debatable point because you'll hear people debate this all the time, but the real fact is, it was that there were certain states in the South that was going to benefit very heavily from the maintenance of slavery. As immoral as that is, it's kind of hard to honor that with some sort of toast or anything like that to that nature. Because really, when it boils down to is the ownership of human beings is, quite frankly, an immoral topic. At the time of Lincoln's death, there was a theory that had gone around for quite some time that Abraham Lincoln was about ready to call an end to the war and let the southern states be the southern states. And, well, obviously that wasn't the case. He pressed on and fought through it. Also, another theory that's out there is about Lincoln himself and his assassination. The idea that John Wilkes Booth was going to assassinate him happened purely by accident, according to this theory. One of the more interesting theories was that Booth and some of his other conspirators had planned on kidnapping Abe Lincoln and holding him hostage to end the war. It's an interesting notion to think about. Nevertheless, that's clearly not what happened. Certainly no conspiracy theories to be had there, right? In regards to the Civil War and those who have passed away and the monuments that would be erected and such, and however political belief you want to fall into, it's your business, I suppose. But in the 1870s, when this thing came up, the idea was to completely and never forget, always remember those that had passed on before us, whether those they were fighting for or not was a decent cause. As a matter of fact, on the other side of this monument is a phrase in Latin which roughly translates, "Those whose fates were denied victory will not be denied immortality." It's an interesting thought. That was the prevalent idea here in those days. That was what you had to do. It's what you had to do to maintain that. My great-grandpappy had fought in all of these wars and did this and did that, and whatever those ideas are hold to may not be so good these days, but nevertheless, there has to be something said for those who find a belief and find an idea that they're willing to die for. Right or wrong, that's a lot of bravery. In fact, a lot of cemeteries, like this one, are filled with headstones of those who were very brave individuals. Were they intelligent? Who knows? Bravery and intelligence doesn't necessarily go hand in hand. It should also be noted, too, that here amongst the dead at the Confederate rest are those Northern soldiers who had perished in the war, specifically during the wreck of the Sultana. It's the largest maritime disaster in American history. It happened on the Mississippi River, just north of Memphis. It was an overloaded steamboat that exploded. They were carrying Northern soldiers that were prisoners of war back to home after the end of the war when the thing exploded. It killed a lot of people, and several of those guys were buried here. And some of the others were actually taken out of here and moved back home north. What an interesting time it must have been to be moving bodies around because of what it was, and these all become some sort of a strange trophy. A participation trophy? Perhaps. Are they the dead of those who had fought and died for the things that they believed in? Absolutely. Is it worth honoring them? In a way, maybe. Not in the ways that we normally would think of these sorts of things, because by God, they were thinking of and they were fighting for things that were, as we would call it, immoral. To this day, we still feel that way, and that's a good thing. It's good to remember that wars like this had been fought, even though that in a lot of cases, these wars are still being fought. It's just fought in a different battlefield. We find them fought in social media and, well, in the comment section of this video, perhaps. Hopefully that's not the case. Because the argument had always been, you're erasing history when you remove such monuments. You're just not putting them in those proper places. A place like this is a perfect place to have those monuments. And if you choose to honor such a thing, then by God, it's your right to do so. Which left us in a strange quandary. how do we handle this sort of thing? How do we wrap this up? Because I didn't want to get into the big details of the war. That's best left for the historians. And there are those who have read and followed this whole action of the Civil War with great interest and great detail, and there are many hobbyists that can tell you many, many more stories than I can. But when you come to sit down and you have a drink with these people, do you drink to their ideals? Do you drink to their foolishness? Do you drink to those things that they hold fast to themselves and were willing to live and die for? They certainly did that. But it would be very difficult for me to sit here and say, well, to all of you, I toast you, because I really don't. However, it might be best mentioned if we just more or less generalized it, don't you think? Perhaps we should toast those who had lived and died fighting for maybe what they believed in, whether it was right or wrong, on both sides. Because a life lost fighting in a war is still a life lost, even though it becomes part of the scorecard at the end of the day. So to that, let's have a drink. We'll see you next time. In the meantime, please subscribe, share the channel, like the channel, and tune us again next time as we go drinking with dead people.